3 for AP American Government and Politics. And today, Chapter 3, we're going to be looking at the concept of federalism, which oftentimes confuses students. What we're talking about with federalism is the concept of having multiple levels of government. So we have the federal, we have state, we have local government. So when you think of federal, think of the multiple levels. Okay. Photograph on the beginning here is an example of it. It's a coronavirus testing center dealing with the coronavirus here in 2020. We basically see the federal government being involved. We have state governments being involved and local governments being involved. Everybody's tackling this crisis right now, and some levels are handling it better than others. But we need all three to be functioning well in order for us to be successful with this. So, this is a video. This is Crash Course. They have a nice episode on federalism. I definitely recommend watching it. Okay. So, what exactly is federalism? Well, like I said, it's an organization where you have multiple levels of government that have authority over the same people, the same area, the same land. So in the United States, we have the United States government, we have the state governments, we have county governments, we have city governments or village or town governments and stuff like that. And all of these different levels basically govern us, okay? Unitary governments, that's where you basically have only a federal level. All the power resides at the central government. And the federal government, like North Korea, has complete and total control. And a confederation is what we tried in the very beginning of our country and failed miserably at it, where we gave almost all the power to the state governments. And it just there's just certain things that are too big for states to handle. So why is it important? Well, it does a couple of different things. Number one, it helps to decentralize our politics. It gives you a lot more opportunities to participate. I hate to break it to you, but you will not grow up to be president of the United States, right? But you could run for school board. You could run for Village of Kimberly president. You could run locally and maybe grow up from there, become a state congressman, maybe then represent the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Congress or something along those lines. It helps to decentralize our politics. It also helps to decentralize our policies. We got federal and state governments handing different problems every single day. What we might be dealing with here in a small little town in the middle of northeastern Wisconsin is going to be a little different than what they're dealing with maybe in south central Los Angeles. So it's good to have these multiple levels of governments because they can deal with the issues that are affecting the people within that area. So as far as the Constitution is concerned, the word federalism never appears in the Constitution. Our founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, most Americans would have had a hard time in the 18th century even grasping the concept of being an American, to be honest with you. They typically considered themselves to be part of the state first. They would consider themselves to be a Wisconsinite first, an American maybe far second or distant third type of thing. And in the Constitution, we do have a couple of things that address specifically the issue between the federal government and the state government. The biggest one is we have what's called the Supremacy Clause. Article 6 of the Constitution states that the United States Constitution, the U.S. laws, they supersede all other laws. They are the supreme laws of the land. But we also have the 10th Amendment that states that, look, if we got a power that we didn't specifically give to the federal government, and it's not prohibited from the states to doing it, then we're going to let the states do it. So I made sure to give power back to the states specifically. Some of the areas where we see that are in education. States usually run your education programs, and also in the areas of running elections. The states are in charge of their elections. So here's a list of things that the national government's responsible for, like coining money, conducting relationships with foreign countries. Here's some things that both the federal and the state governments basically do. They both are really good at borrowing money. They both get to tax people. And then we have some where only the state's government gets to do, such as setting up your local governments or regulating commerce within your state specifically, okay? So we get all these different things, and this is a little graph to kind of show you some of the different policies and powers that are granted to either the state, federal, or both. Within the federal government, we have what's called implied powers. This is something that was established with McCulloch versus Maryland, one of those Supreme Court cases that we have to know about. where basically they said that, yeah, Congress has specific powers that are listed in the Constitution, but they also have other powers that are implied in order for them to do their duties. An example of this is like something that's not specifically laid out in the Constitution, but if we want them to have the powers they're supposed to have in the Constitution, this also falls into that category. An example would be establishing a minimum wage. There's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress can establish a minimum wage, but they do get to regulate trade and commerce. And they basically have wrapped up the idea of a minimum wage as part of that. Commerce powers, this is from a Supreme Court case of Gibbons versus Ogden. This is not one of the Supreme Court cases you need to know. It said that the government, especially Congress, has very broad, very encompassing commerce powers. And that can basically regulate a number of different activities because they're in charge of all things commerce. Sometimes they overstep a little bit, but the U.S. Congress gets a lot of powers with that commerce power. All right. Establishing national supremacies, there's a number of good examples of this. You could look at the Civil War, or you could look at the Civil Rights Movement. Both of them have great examples of this. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln gets elected president in 1860, and then we have a number of southern states who basically become traitors and rebellious, and they leave the Union. They basically break away from the United States. At that point, Lincoln could have said, good, fine, we don't need you, and let them go. But he basically forced the establishment of the Northern government to bring them back into the Union. Okay? It asserted his powers over the Southern states, and we forced them back into the Union. In the Civil Rights Movement, we saw a number of situations where even after Brown versus Board of Education, which was ruled by the Supreme Court in 1954, said that we had to desegregate our public schools, there were a number of states that were like, forget it, we're not going to do it. So the federal government had to step in and force these states to follow federal laws and federal rulings. This is an example of Alabama's governor back in the 1960s, George Wallace, standing in front of one of the Alabama University, I believe it was, basically saying we're not going to allow African-American students into our university. He's basically, it's all kind of for show there, because standing right in front of him is a U.S. district attorney basically saying, yeah, you're going to. And there were even extreme cases like in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the United States government sent in federal troops to force those states to comply with the ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. Sometimes states just need help to do the right thing, right? All right, so states' obligations to each other. There are certain things that are specifically laid out in the Constitution of how states have to treat in the relationships they have to have with other states. One of them is the idea of full faith in credit, okay? Full faith in credit. Article 9 of the Constitution states that each state has to recognize the public acts, the public records, the public judicial proceedings of all other states. So if somebody basically has a record in one state, it basically carries over to other states, for example. Extradition, it says that, look, if you commit a crime in Illinois and you flee across the border to Wisconsin, it's not like you get off scot-free. The police in Wisconsin will arrest you, and then we will extradite you. We will send you back to the state of Illinois where you committed the crime to be basically charged with that crime. Privileges and immunities. The Constitution says that each state has to give citizens of each state the privileges and citizenship of other states, which means that if you have a driver's license at the age of 15 in South Carolina, which I believe is the law that the age that you can get a driver's license in South Carolina, you have an official South Carolina driver's license. But in Wisconsin, we don't give driver's license until you're 16. Well, if a 15-year-old drives up in the state of Wisconsin, they're still perfectly legal for driving. They have a registered, recognized driver's license from a state, and we recognize them in all 50 states. Okay? A good example, by the way, of that full faith and credit is like the issue of gay marriage. When we started to see individual states were starting to accept gay marriage and to issue marriage license to gay couples, that became an issue for other states who didn't want to recognize them. Because now, what do? If the state of Massachusetts is issuing marriage license to both same-sex and not same-sex couples, they're married. They have a marriage license. In the state of Wisconsin, we recognize a marriage license from Massachusetts. So are we going to say, well, we'll recognize that marriage license, but not that one? And that's where we started to see a more federal approach needed to be taken in regards to gay marriage. And that's where the Supreme Court stepped in. All right. Dual federalism. Dual federalism looks just like this cake. It's a layer cake. It's a system of government where we see national government, we see state government, we see local governments, and they all have their own specific sphere, their own responsibilities, their own powers and policies. This is what we had maybe at the very beginning of our Constitution, the beginning of our government, but we certainly don't see this today. What we see today is more like a marble cake. It's all swirled and mixed together. This is cooperative federalism. This is a system where government powers and policies, it's shared by both the state, federal, local governments. Okay, and with that shared powers and policies come also some shared costs, and sometimes some guidelines that come along with it. So what we have been seeing probably in the last 20 years is something we call devolution. Devolution is when you transfer the responsibilities from the federal government and give it back to the states or back to the local governments. So we're seeing more and more federal power being removed from the federal government and being given back to the states. Okay, a good example of this is in regards to welfare. We're seeing the federal government saying like, hey, we'll help pay some of the cost of this, but as far as issuing like who's on welfare, what kind of welfare reception they should get, what they should receive from it, we're going to let that up to each and every individual state. So what you might receive for example, what we commonly refer to as food stamps might differ and vary from state to state because the states are establishing the protocols for what basically qualifies an individual and then what exactly they get. We do have something called fiscal federalism. This is where we see spending and taxing and grants provided by the federal government. The federal government has a lot of money, a crazy amount of money, and then they basically will give this out to states and local governments through different programs, oftentimes through different types of grants. We're talking about a significant amount of money. 2 years ago, in 2018, the federal government gave out $728 billion in federal grants to the states. Now, this graph here is showing you basically from the year 1955 to 2015, and you can see it's not like it's increasing, it is skyrocketing. So the federal government is basically saying like, okay, we're going to keep our hands clean of this. We're not going to deal with it. We're going to let the states deal with it, but here's some money to deal with it. Okay. Now, in the grant system, not all grants are made equal. There are some grants that are more desirable than others, and some come with more restrictions and federal paperwork and red tape and limitations than others. You have, for example, what's called categorical grants. These are grants that are basically designed for a specific type of program. It's a project grant or a formula grant. It can be used for a specific purpose, and oftentimes there are strings attached to it. All right. So that might be, for example, it might be a specific like grant for a federal highway funds, and you can only spend that money upgrading federal highways that run through your state. So you're getting a bunch of money from the state. That's great. You're getting a bunch of money from the federal government, and that's great. But it comes with some restrictions, some strings attached. You have to spend it on these highways that exist in your state. Now, a block grant, that's a grant that's a lot more open, and it oftentimes allows the state or the local governments to decide how best to use it. States tend to like block grants a lot more. And what we've seen in the states is there's a big scramble for these federal dollars. More and more states want to receive more and more of the grant. The federal government has so much money to distribute to everyone. And you want to make sure that your state gets as much of the federal grant money as possible. So you basically are going to make sure that you get as much of the federal dollars as you can. Now, there's something called what they call mandate blues. And this is where either the federal government says you have to do this. You must comply with this rule. And if you don't, there can be a consequence for it. All right. And so it's kind of the idea of a carrot or a stick. How do you get a donkey to move? You can either dangle a carrot in front of them and entice them, reward them for moving forward, or you can get a stick and punish them if they don't move forward. And so a carrot would be like, hey, if you guys do something to reduce the amount of meth drug use in your state, we basically, if you show us real numbers that you basically have made improvements, we'll give you a grant for it to help you fight it. A punishment is like, hey, if you don't do this, then we're going to withhold funds from you. A good example of this is the drinking age, right? The drinking age is actually established by the states, but every state, as far as I know, has set their drinking age at 21. It wasn't that long ago, 30 years ago or so, 35 years ago, where the drinking age in a number of states was actually lower than that. In the state of Wisconsin, the drinking age was 18, which was not ideal. It literally meant that you would have high school seniors who could leave school at lunchtime, go down to the local bar and have a burger and fries and a couple of beers, and then come back to class in the afternoon. So this was realized that this was not the best for the country. So the federal government wanted the states to raise the drinking age from 18 to 21. But they didn't have the power to actually do it. The states controlled that. So what they did instead is they incentivized them. They said, hey, either you raise the drinking age to 21 in your state, or we're going to withhold federal highway funds. That's millions upon millions of dollars that would be withheld from your state. And so what we saw is very quickly, for every state, basically raised their drinking age from 18 to 21. Now, when we're talking about how much money, we're talking about not millions, which is showed here. Let's see if you can see that. That's $1 million. That's disappointing, right? It's like you think it could be more. That's $1 billion. Now we're talking, that's more serious. Now we have pallets, but that's nothing. We're talking about trillions of dollars that are in the federal government. And you can't see it, but that little guy is standing right over here. There he is. See him? And now that pallets are now double pallets. They're stacked. There is the difference between $1 billion and $1 trillion is the difference between throwing a bullet at somebody and shooting a bullet at somebody. There is no difference. There's no comparison between the two. All right. Federalism and democracy. So how do these things go hand in hand? Well, with federalism and with democracy, what they do is they help pair each other together so we have more access to government. You have more access to government because you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. just to talk to somebody in government. You can go down to your local town hall. You can go to your local school board. You can go to your local county and deal with these issues. Another way that they basically are connected together is local problems can oftentimes be solved locally. We have specific local issues that we have to deal with that people in other states, other areas of the states, other areas of the country don't have to deal with it. So let us deal with those issues locally, and local governments allow us to do that. And individual states have the same issue, right? And if we are a state that is very, a large part of our economy is based on such as dairy farming, we can make sure that that has an influence in the federal government when it comes time to how much money the federal government is going to spend. An interest concentrated in the state can exercise substantial influences in the election of that state's officials. So if you basically are seeing government officials in your state not dealing with the issues that you're concerned about, you can address that and deal with that in your state election. It also makes it more difficult, allegedly, for political parties to dominate all of politics if you have these multiple levels. I mean, you have the federal government, we have 50 state governments. In the state of Wisconsin, we have 72 counties, and then we have thousands of villages, towns, and cities. It's hard to imagine that one political party would rule all of them. Okay. States have different, this is continuing on. States have different quality and quantity of public services. Until you move around a little bit and go from one state to the other, you may not notice it. But what the state of Wisconsin will do for its people may be way different than what the state of Mississippi or Alabama might do for their people. Sometimes your local interests can be counteractive to the nation's interest. We saw that a lot in the civil rights movement, where especially the southern states were dragging their feet and doing everything in their powers to fight the idea of inclusion. And the federal government has had to step in, sometimes with troops, and say, yeah, you're going to do this. Whether you want to or not, you're going to do this. And like I said, we have lots of different governments throughout the United States. There are over almost 90,000 governments within the United States looking at federal, state, and local. So the problem with that is it's hard for us to stay focused on what's important to us. it's hard to figure out, like, okay, what's going on at the federal level? Okay, what's my state doing? What is my county doing? What is my local government doing? But it also allows us to have contact with these individuals. I can actually meet with the person who's in charge of my local government. I can schedule a meeting and probably walk into their office and sit down and have a conversation with them. I can't do that with the president. Trust me, I've tried. Okay, so this is those different levels of government we talked about. 1 U.S. government, 50 states, 3,000 counties, 19,000 municipalities, 16,000 townships or towns, 13,000 school districts, and 37,000 other or special districts that exist in this country. That's a lot of different types of government. And they all have to work together. And unfortunately, they don't always do that very well. The COVID response has been a good example of it, where we haven't seen great leadership at many different levels of government, right? We're seeing some inconsistency with the messages that we're getting from the federal governments. We see inconsistency with what one state's doing and what other states are doing. And we even see that within our local areas. For example, I know that in where I live, which is Outagamie County in Wisconsin, up until just recently, and I'm recording this in December of 2020, we just got a testing center in our county, the first one, and it's only open like 3 days a week. It took us this long to get that up. Why? How? Right? So sometimes we can see our government fails us, and when we really run into problems is when we see multiple levels of government fail us. In the textbook we use for this class, it's a little bit older, it's about 10 years old, and so the example they use of federalism is an actual failure of federalism. They look at the government response to Hurricane Katrina, where we saw the federal government basically screw up. We saw the state and local levels of government also screw up, and people died because of it. And we got the same issue going on right now with COVID. All right. So federalism and the scope of national government. Well, national power has been increased with industrialization, expansive individual rights, and social services. Most of our issues, concerns, and problems require resources that are afforded to the national, not state government. So a lot of our issues might be something we deal with locally, but that money's going to oftentimes come from at the federal level. So that's it for chapter 3. If you have any questions, leave me a comment and let me know. All right. Good luck, guys.